Hello, my sweets. Welcome back to Bedtime with Mama. Tonight we're going to read a magical story from our princess collection called Snow White to the Rescue. Snow White and her prince spent nearly every day together, but one particularly sunny morning, the prince told Snow White that he had an important errand to take care of. "I will be away for several hours, I'm afraid," he said. "I'll miss you," said Snow White. The prince saddled his trusty steed, Aster, and bid Snow White farewell. "Take good care of my prince," Snow White said, slipping a flower into Aster's bridle, and then she gave one to the prince. "And take good care of Aster," she said, for Snow White loved the faithful horse too. She smiled and waved as she watched them trot off down the road. Snow White decided to spend her day gardening. The time flew by, and before long, she looked up and saw a cloud of dust on the road, a horse rapidly approaching. "Oh, good," she exclaimed. "The prince and Aster are home early." She hurried towards the gate to greet them as they arrived. Imagine Snow White's surprise when she saw that Aster was alone. The princess looked up from Aster's empty saddle to the quiet road. "Why, where's my prince?" she wondered aloud. She tried not to panic, but her heart quickly filled with dread. Surely the prince is in some sort of trouble, she thought. Why else would Aster return to the palace without him? "I must go and find him," she declared bravely, and without wasting another moment, she grabbed her cloak and started down the road. Suddenly, Snow White felt Aster's warm breath on the back of her neck. She nuzzled her impatiently. "What is it?" she asked. The horse stomped its hoof on the ground and nodded towards the empty saddle. "Do you want me to get on?" Snow White asked. Again, Aster nodded. Quickly, the princess pulled herself into the saddle. She barely had time to sit down before Aster was racing down the road towards the forest. Aster ran deeper and deeper into the woods, with Snow White tugging uselessly at the reins. The princess tried not to think about all the dangers that might await them on the dark path ahead. If only she knew where Aster was taking her. If only she knew that the prince was safe. Tirelessly, Aster galloped through the woods. She darted between trees and leapt over briars and brambles. Then suddenly, Snow White spotted a piece of red cloth caught on a long, sharp thorn. A knot formed in her throat. Could it be? It was a scrap torn from the prince's riding cloak. As they continued on their journey, Snow White glimpsed a spot of red on the muddy ground. There was no mistaking those deep crimson petals. They were from the rose Snow White had given the prince that morning. She worried even more. At last they reached a river. Surely Aster will have to stop here, Snow White thought. But the pace only quickened. It seemed that Aster planned to jump across the river. Just then Snow White saw the prince's feathered hat dangling from a tree limb high above the water. As Aster leapt across the river, Snow White reached up as high as she could and plucked the hat from the branch. Snow White gripped Aster's reins with one hand as she galloped along. Her thoughts were soon interrupted by a startling noise. "Oh!" Snow White cried. Aster bravely reared up to defend her. "Well, hello there. Hello there," said a familiar voice. "Doc?" Snow White said with a sigh of relief. "I am so glad to see you." It was the Seven Dwarfs. "Likewise, my dear. But what's the matter?" Doc asked, surprised to see the princess looking so upset. "It's the prince," Snow White said, showing him the crumpled hat. "I have to find him." "Don't worry, princess," Doc assured her. "We can help you. Just follow Aster," she said. "She seems to know the way." The Seven Dwarves and their ponies followed Snow White and Aster through the depths of the forest and over a deep, rocky cavern. "Oh," said bashful, looking down. I hope the prince isn't down there. Shh, Grumpy growled back at him. You'll scare the princess. But Snow White had heard. She clutched the prince's hat and concentrated on thinking hopeful thoughts. Finally, they emerged into a sunny clearing, and Aster slowed to a stop. Snow White blinked in the bright light and then spotted the prince lying on the ground. Oh no, she cried. Aster knelt down slightly so the princess could slip out of the saddle. The faithful horse whined as Snow White raced across the clearing to the prince's side. Don't worry, she said. I'm coming. Breathless, Snow White reached the prince just as he sat up and stretched. What a nice nap, he said. And what a lovely way to wake up. Surprise, I hope you're hungry. Snow White was bewildered. Next to the prince lay a lavish picnic spread out on a soft blanket, and the prince was as happy and healthy as ever. I knew Aster would get you here quickly, he said, beaming. The prince looked amused, and the 7 dwarfs began digging into the delicious food. Well, I'm glad I brought a little extra, he laughed. Me too, Snow White replied. She picked up an apple and offered it to Aster. And, she added, I'm very glad you have such a dear and clever horse. The end. Wasn't that a great story of Aster the horse helping Snow White to find the prince? And it turns out the prince had planned a lovely picnic for Snow White and all of her friends as well. Well, I hope you have lovely dreams tonight, and I will see you tomorrow night. Sweet dreams.